With Palpatine died any hope of changing the course of the Galactic Civil War and any ultimate Imperial victory over the New Republic. More or less by this point in time, the New Republic was there to stay, and the Empire was more or less a spent force. The vast majority of the remaining Imperial fleet had been lost during Operation Shadowhand, in part due to the mutiny over Coruscant, which, as I said, saw the entire or the vast majority of the remaining Imperial fleet gathered in one place, where everyone just started shooting everybody. They lost a whole bunch during the offensives, because while the New Republic took greater losses, Palpatine's offensive against the core world relied mostly on just brute force and overwhelming numbers, rather than any kind of any kind of planning. In contrast, Thrawn was always extremely conservative with losses. He hated to lose any men under his command, in part because of his obsession with efficiency, in part because Thrawn had a great sense of personal honor. And to him, not being able, protecting the men under his command and not wasting their lives was his duty as a commander. It was his duty as a warrior. Palpatine, however, recklessly used the lives of his men, and even though the Empire won Operation Shadowhand, they took atrocious losses relative to their strength. Of course, though, the final nail in the coffin was the destruction of Biss. Biss had kind of been acting as a reserve force, and the entirety of the Imperial fleet that wasn't engaged in other campaigns was circling around it. When it blew up, they lost like a dozen dreadnoughts. They lost probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Star Destroyers, etc. It was a total disaster. As I said, I think previously, once we get into the Imperial reunification, Truden Teradok only had about 60 Victory class Star Destroyers, and Blitzer Harris only had about 12 Imperial class Star Destroyers. Keep in mind, the Empire had something like 16,000 Imperial class Star Destroyers prior to the Battle of Endor. So we can see just how rapidly things have fallen apart. Kind of the largest remaining Imperial factions we have are, like I said, the Greater Muldrude under Truden Teradok, Zero Command. Citric Hegemony had been destroyed by the New Republic. The Iriadu Authority had reestablished itself within the Deep Core. But none of these people really had much in the way of forces. Probably the largest remaining Imperial factions were the Pentastar Alignment. Now, during Operation Shadowhand, Ardis Kane had been killed. A Grand Admiral had lured him. A Grand Admiral who had defected to the New Republic lured him into a trap and killed him. And interestingly, although he died, his flagship, the Reaper, which was an Executor class Star Dreadnought, had managed to survive and was still in service of the Pentastar Alignment. And while the Pentastar Alignment began to kind of drag itself along in a very inefficient way, it was still alive. It still kind of continued going, but it was once again a shadow of its former self. Now, the mainstream empire, as it were, fell under the rule of a new emperor, Karnor Jax. Now, Karnor Jax was a Imperial Guardsman, and it became known as the Crimson Empire because he continued to wear his Imperial Guard uniform even after declaring himself Emperor. So, as I had said previously, the Imperial Ruling Council was really scared because Palpatine was going completely insane, and working with Karnor Jax, they sabotaged the last remaining Palpatine clones, which played a large role in Palpatine's final death. Now, Karnor Jax, immediately after Palpatine died, killed the last few members of the Imperial Ruling Council and formed his own junta with a number of admirals and generals advised. However, as a Imperial sovereign protector, Karnor Jax was force sensitive, and he considered himself to be almost the equal of Darth Vader, which is insanity because he's nowhere near as strong as Darth Vader. And he felt that with enough study, he could eventually become as great as the Emperor. Now, interestingly, he was the Sith apprentice to Lumiya. Lumiya? I don't know how you pronounce her name, but the Dark Lady of the Sith, who had been Darth Vader's secret apprentice, and who had succeeded Vader and Palpatine as the head of the Rule of Two Sith. So Karnor Jax was one of the last of Bane's line of Sith Lords. Although, once again, as with everything else, they had been reduced to a shadow of their former selves. So yeah, so Karnor Jax ruled as the head of the Crimson Empire, which, as is described in the wiki, and just I have the Essential Atlas, but the Essential Atlas is basically the same as the wiki. So the Crimson Empire was a small strip of a long, narrow strip of territory that went from the Deep Core to the Outer Rim and bordered the Deep Core warlords in the Petastar alignment. Very few people acknowledged it, though, and when Karnor Jax died, this was the last incarnation of the mainstream empire. Any kind of attempt at a successor state to Palpatine's empire was dead. While the Empire would eventually reform itself as the Imperial Remnant under Dala and Pelion, that was a reformation of what had at that point been a dead state. The mainstream Empire, as it's known, was kind of limping along for a long time under the Imperial Ruling Council and Isard. And once Palpatine came back, but with the final death of the Imperial Ruling Council, there wasn't even anyone pretending to be the head of the Empire anymore. So, I don't have a ton to say about Crimson Empire. Kind of the main thing about Crimson Empire was about Kir Kanos versus Karnor Jax. They had both gone through Imperial Guard training together. Kir Kanos was the last loyal Imperial Guard. After Karnor Jax had become Emperor, he sent 3 legions of stormtroopers to kill the remaining Imperial Guard after luring them into a trap. The Imperial Guard had died, but they had let Kir Kanos escape with the hope that he would be able to avenge Karnor Jax and kill the remaining plotters who had dishonored Palpatine. So Kir Kanos is interesting because he's an anti-villain, or a villain protagonist, because he is an Imperial Guardsman who's still very loyal to Palpatine, but at the same time he's a very honorable, just man. He's overall a good man. He's just in service. His loyalty is held to a complete psychopath, and he kind of briefly joins up with the rebels, or I guess the New Republic at this point, to fight against Karnor Jax, and he kind of joins with them, and he becomes the lover of some rebel woman, etc. It's interesting because we find out how Imperial Guard are trained. So the very best stormtroopers are recruited into the Imperial Guard training program. The ones who are force sensitive eventually become Imperial sovereign protectors and get lightsabers and force pikes. But yeah, so they train in pairs, and the pairs are basically tasked to do everything together. All the Imperial Guard are brothers, and they call each other brother, and they become as close as possible. And their final test is to fight each other to the death, and whoever wins gets to become a member of the Imperial Guard, which I think is extremely wasteful, just given the amount of resources they spend training the Imperial Guard, and they're getting them to kill each other. Like, I get the idea of having them fight to see who's better, and I get that the goal of this is to try to ensure their absolute personal loyalty to Palpatine, but couldn't they let the loser go and become a Storm Commando or something, or join the Special Forces? It just seems a waste of the Empire's best and most loyal soldiers, but it's a very Palpatine thing to do. So Kir Kanos, if you want to read Crimson Empire, the audiobook isn't bad, actually. Kir Kanos is a pretty big badass. There's a scene in Crimson Empire where he takes down a TIE fighter with his blaster. He uses the Force and he shoots his blaster and it goes through the viewport at the front of the TIE fighter and kills the pilot and it crashes, which is pretty badass. And eventually it leads to a showdown between him and Karnor Jax, and he succeeds in killing Karnor Jax, and then leaves to go kill the rest of the conspirators against Palpatine. So with the death of Karnor Jax, there's no longer a mainstream empire. It's completely gone. All that's left is a bunch of warlords, and we'll talk about them later. There isn't really factions of warlords since they're all fighting each other, but you have the ones like Superior General Devideris, or however you pronounce his name, and Blitzer Harsk, who want the empire to be refounded, and believe themselves to be the next Sanders Delverdis. Yeah, him and Blitzer Harsk to be reunited, whereas Truden Teradok doesn't believe in that anymore and just wants to carve out his own kingdom in the deep core. So that's going on. It's time for something completely different. We're going to talk about the Black Fleet Crisis. Now, the Black Fleet Crisis is one of the larger scale engagements the New Republic had in the post-Endor period, until we really get into the Yuzon Vong in the Legacy era, where they actually face an opponent who's not the Empire. So the Yevetha, I think that's how you pronounce it. The Yevetha were a sentient species that lived in the territory that would eventually become known as the Duskin League. They're a really weird looking people. I'm not sure if they're like a skeletal species. So I don't know. They kind of remind me a bit of Kalish. Like General Grievous's people is kind of who they remind me of. But they were being particularly clever, and they were not a particularly powerful species, so the Empire conquered their worlds and used them as slaves because they were smart enough to work on starships. So the Empire built a bunch of shipyards within their area that became known as Black Sword Command. Now, in the aftermath of Endor, the Yevetha took advantage of the chaos and they launched a coup, and they succeeded in taking over all of Black Sword Command, which I forget how large it is exactly, but it's several dozen Imperial Star Destroyers, a bunch of other ships, and the Executor class star Dreadnought Intimidator, which they renamed Pride of Yevetha. So, having done that, they captured the Imperial Navy personnel who were there, and they gradually killed them over time, but kept a bunch around. So the Duskin League, with this huge Imperial fleet, became a major regional power and gradually conquered more and more territory. Now, they were located fairly close to the Deep Core, and the New Republic wanted to get them kind of on their side because they thought they would be a useful ally in finishing off the Empire. However, the Yevetha were not really willing to play ball. They had been building up their forces for years. Now, Yevetha were extremely xenophobic, to the point that they viewed all of their species, I'd say as being subhuman, but they aren't human, so being as subsentient, and that they had a right to govern all of the galaxy. So, Neil Spar, the viceroy of the Duskin League, went to Coruscant to negotiate with then Chief of State Leia Organa Solo, who had recently become the Chief of State in the aftermath of the... what's her name? Mon Mothma had gotten cancer or some sort of illness, and although she had been healed by a Jedi healer, she was increasingly frail and had resigned in favor of Leia. And Leia underwent a whole bunch of criticism. She had kind of been a compromise candidate who was largely a moderate. She was not as much of an extreme war hawk as somebody like Belgar Midlist, nor was she an extreme dove who wanted to seek complete rapprochement with the Emperor. So she was kind of liked and disliked by both sides. And Neil Spar showed up, and basically he's like, all we want is peace. The New Republic is infringing on our territory. They're bad, etc. So anyways, it's not particularly interesting or important, but a whole bunch of political maneuvering went down, wherein the Yevetha, while they were negotiating with the New Republic for trade and perhaps entry, launched their main offensive, and they began to exterminate the population on all the worlds within their cluster. And they exterminated dozens of species and established colonies on all the new worlds, because no one was in their league, pun not intended, and they just continued to slaughter people. So there began to be low-level skirmishes between the New Republic and the Yevetha. Eventually, Leia decided to take decisive action and granted all the worlds within the cluster who had basically begged the New Republic for membership so that the New Republic would have a diplomatic reason to intervene. She granted them all membership basically overnight, and Leia made a big speech about how they were going to go to war against the Yevetha, how they're evil, etc. So Han Solo volunteered to lead the fleet against the Yevetha himself. So he was given the rank of Commodore, and they sent him to go take head of the Republic's main offensive fleet, the Fifth Fleet. However, the Yevetha had used a interdictor cruiser and pulled him and his shuttle out of hyperspace, and the Yevetha captured him and began to torture him, and they broadcast Han Solo being tortured on the HoloNet. So they basically said, we're going to torture Han Solo to death unless you back down. And all this did was just piss Leia off. So she declared formal and complete and total war against the Duskin League and sent the Fifth Fleet in with the intention of utterly destroying the Yevetha once and for all. She gave a huge speech. So Han Solo was rescued from the Star Dreadnought by Chewbacca and his family because Wookiees are based. And after Han Solo got away, the New Republic fleet showed up, and they faced down the massive Yevetha fleet. It was going to be a clash of the Titans. Both sides had a huge number of ships. By this point in time, the New Republic was well along in the development of their new model fleet modernization program. Basically, prior to this, the New Republic had just been using a bunch of cobbled together ships from various sources. Obviously, a lot of Mon Calamari ships, a lot of Clone War era ships, a lot of things that they had refitted. So what they decided to do was just to build a completely new fleet from scratch using modern technology. So we get out of this the Nebula class Star Destroyer, which is incredibly good. You get the Endurance Fleet Carrier, you get the Majestic class, you eventually will have the Viscount Star Defender, aka Star Dreadnought. So their fleet was a lot better now than it had been in the past. True, they had lost most of their fleet fighting the Empire during Operation Shadowhand, but the Fifth Fleet was completely modern, and their ships were better than anything the Empire had put out, because the Empire hadn't really updated their ships in almost 2 decades by this point in time. They had really failed to introduce a successor to the Imperial 2. Anyway, so they faced each other down, and then it was revealed that over all the years that the captured Imperials had been servicing the ships in the Yevethan fleet, they had installed slave rigging within all of them, and pressing a couple buttons, they activated it, and they did stuff like venting the command bridges of oxygen, locking down and letting them starve, and activating internal defenses, and the Imperials managed to retake all of the Imperial ships that had been part of Black Sword Command and jumped away. This only left the Yevetha's ships, which were largely cruiser-sized thrust ships, to face the New Republic, and the New Republic proceeded to slaughter them with the fanatical Yevetha fighting for the last man. The Yevetha were removed physically from all their new colony worlds and were basically put under close watch for several decades in the future. So that ended the Black Fleet crisis. As for what happened to the rest of Black Sword Command, they all went to Biss upon finding the planet destroyed. Some of them joined the New Republic, some of them joined the Warlords, and some of them would eventually make their way to the Imperial Remnant once Pelion had moved it to the Outer Rim. The Black Fleet crisis showed the New Republic that they had to further build up their military, as they didn't really have a good counter for the Intimidator or the Pride of Yevetha. They still had the Lusancia, but it had been mothballed in the aftermath of Crimson Empire. And yeah, so that's basically what happened in the post-Shadowhand period. We didn't really get too far in the overall plot line, but next time we're going to talk about Dala, we're going to talk about Imperial reunification, and we probably have 2 or 3 episodes left after this. So sorry if this is a little disjointed, but these are kind of side things to a certain extent. True, Crimson Empire directly comes after Operation Shadowhand, but it's still kind of a bit nebulous and out there. Anyways, I'll talk to you guys later.